Traditionally, the final Brownbag lecture session of the academic year is the presentation by the winner of our annual Laird essay contest. And the contest is now offered on both graduate and undergraduate level. Unfortunately, we do not have an undergraduate winner this year, but we have a very deserving graduate winner, who is our own John Stanko, who will be graduating with a master's degree from our center in a few days. So we are proud of him and of the journey he has had on this path. And importantly, this is not just a recognition in terms of getting to present this work, being recognized in Reese records, but very importantly, it's also financial support. So this is a check from the endowment. Congratulations, Earl.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I will put that somewhere safe.
Thank you for your hard work. And now we are looking forward to hear what you have to say. And just sorry for the interruption. Before I pass the floor to John, a reminder that this Friday is our traditional stop day session, which will be slightly later this morning. This Friday morning, it will be at 11 a.m. But we still very much hope that everyone will be able to join us and catch up on what are good things that our center and many good people that are affiliated with it have been doing over the past semester. Now, John, the floor is yours.
And I will just insert a tiny little introduction here. So John defended his master's thesis yesterday, so yay, wonderful.
Done with that.
And of course, he'll graduate this May with a master's degree in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And he was also recently chosen to participate in the Siberia by Southwest program, a Fulbright-funded summer study abroad program in Irkutsk, Russia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Drs. Chunetsky and Beinik. My capstone was actually on Russia-China relations that I just defended yesterday, so that's kind of the background of how this particular Laird submission came about. My secondary interest, my first is international relations, my second is higher education, how different countries do higher education. So that's actually part of what I'll be doing in Irkutsk this summer is I'm going to look at motivations for why Russian students study China and the Chinese language. So with that said, usually there'd be a more elaborate presentation, but since I just had to defend yesterday, there wasn't a ton of time. So the title is The Relevancy Gambit, a vision for the future evolution of the Russia-China relationship. Many experts have questioned the tenability of the current Russia-China partnership, and rightfully so. As economic trading partners, Russia is increasingly reduced to a mere supplier of natural resources to the burgeoning Chinese state. As strategic partners, Russian incursions into Ukraine and Georgia, and to a lesser extent its involvement in Syria, undermine the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence espoused by Beijing as the model for harmonious international relations.
Just a tiny bit slower.
Okay, we'll start. I'll go slower. I'll just start from the top. Many experts have questioned the tenability of the current Russia-China partnership, and rightfully so. As economic trading partners, Russia is increasingly being reduced to a mere supplier of natural resources to the burgeoning Chinese state. As strategic partners, Russian incursions into Ukraine and Georgia, and to a lesser extent its involvement in Syria, undermine the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence espoused by Beijing as the model for harmonious international relations. As military partners, there remains a distinct disconnect, as no formal alliance exists, and Russia not only refrains from selling its most advanced weapons technologies to China, but it also arms India and other of China's geopolitical rivals. Last but not least, as former land empires both, the perpetually unresolved situation with Chinese migration into the Russian Far East, the last remaining vestiges of the unequal treaties of the 1800s that China has not reclaimed, represents a significant stumbling block to cooperative relations. Indeed, the signs seem to indicate that should multipolarity be achieved in the near future, that is, before anything changes fundamentally in regards to the status quo between the two states, Moscow and Beijing will quickly find themselves at odds. However, although in a strictly realist view there's cause to question the legitimacy of the current strategic partnership, in quotes, there are also areas for potential cooperation. The proposed Silk Belt and Road Initiative is one example, as is the threat of transnational terrorism. However, this piece will consider a more abstract topic, an aspect of soft power that merits consideration as a potential bridge to reconciling imbalances in the relationship. This author, and it just says this author because it has to be anonymous for the purposes of the Laird judging, but I believe that Russia can leverage higher education as a starting point for even closer ties with China, ties that far surpass the questionable extant bond, built largely as it is upon opposition to a third party, the U.S. Indeed, Chinese and Russian goals currently converge quite closely when it comes to higher education. China has sent ever-increasing numbers of students abroad to learn from world-class universities around the globe, with over 500,000 Chinese studying elsewhere in 2015. Meanwhile, Russia has been investing great effort and financial resources towards a revival of the country's academic prestige. This aim is embodied in the so-called 5-100 program, which, although ostensibly intended to see 5 Russian universities into the top 100 world rankings by 2020, has been framed increasingly as simply an effort to increase the prestige of Russian higher education in the eyes of the global community. Led by Moscow State University, 15 Russian universities were included in the most recent U.S. News and World rankings, while 27 made it into the Times Higher Education ranking, and both those entities rank around 1,000 to 1,250 schools throughout the world. Thus, although Chinese institutions such as Tsinghua University remain more highly regarded, a growing number of Russian destinations are becoming academically appealing for those students denied entry to China's best, and inevitably in a country with several hundreds of thousands of college-age citizens. Moreover, Moscow has recently allotted funding for an additional 5,000 full tuition scholarships for international students, raising the figure to 20,000 available stipends. However, there is a very important aspect to this potential partnership that makes Russia and China appealing to one another. Whereas China wants its cachet of young, newly educated citizens to return to the Middle Kingdom after graduation, the head of Russia's Federal Agency for the Commonwealth of Independent States, I won't include the whole title there, the head of Russia's Federal Agency for the Commonwealth of Independent States, Compatriots Living Abroad, and International Cultural Cooperation, has expressly stated her desire to see international students return home to their respective countries as ambassadors for Russia. Thus, unlike the United States, which generally seeks to recruit the best and the brightest from other countries to stay, the Russian government would rather see them take leadership positions elsewhere and use their influence to advocate on Russia's behalf. For its part, China's education ministry offers research subsidies to its returning students and proudly boasts a return rate of approximately 80%. And certainly there's some logic to this equilibrium. Russia is facing a rather sharp demographic decline and has been wary of accepting too many foreigners into the country. Given the current immigration crisis that Russia can observe confronting Europe, this is hardly a surprising policy approach. On the other side, President Xi Jinping of China has stressed the importance of education as a poverty alleviation measure. Russia is one of the most affordable places on earth to receive a higher education, and education there is approximately 1/3 cheaper than in China. But can this educational coalescence truly do anything to solidify Russia-China relations over the long term? John L. Thornton has noted that most foreign-educated government officials in China, that is, returning students who studied abroad, have been viewed with suspicion by their counterparts who graduated within the country. If students studying in Russia are only able to make an impact at the local level, it does significantly limit the potential benefits of the exchange. And while there has also been growing discontent within the current Chinese Communist Party's government, a lot of this dissatisfaction seems to emanate from nationalist factions of the populace. Thus, it is unlikely that the introduction of more officials educated outside the mainland would do anything to increase domestic stability or regime legitimacy. That is, it's not really appealing to Beijing. It's not a win-win proposition for Russia either. The Russian Federation has been confronting a brain drain, at least since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Devoting scarce resources to the education of foreigners, even if it also entails improving the country's higher education system, may not be a wise investment. Indeed, one of the most poignant criticisms of the 5-100 program is that it diverts money away from primary and secondary education for Russian students, Russia has among the lowest proportions of spending on childhood education among Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation member states. From this perspective, it would seem that Russia is merely compounding the problem and putting itself into further difficulties. China will continue to possess a highly educated and still growing population, while Russia is left with ever-diminishing native human capital. The most obvious concern with pursuing this approach would be Russia's diminished ability to maintain its military technological superiority. Put simply, in the absence of innovative thinkers, Russia would certainly seem destined to become an irrelevant country in international affairs, a second-rate participant at best. This, of course, clashes with Russia's image of itself as a great power possessing a weighty opinion on global issues. But this author is not convinced that Russia's quest for status as an educational great power that exports its graduates necessarily precludes the country from maintaining a privileged position in the world order. Put simply, Moscow seeks to increase the internationalism of its faculty and student body, largely for the purpose of increasing its soft power abroad. The problem lies in the fact that soft power is not a cure-all. One should not forget that America's soft power is backed up by very real hard power capabilities, should antagonism be encountered. Russia, though, cannot realistically afford such a coupling. It was, after all, the exorbitant cost of an arms race that played a major role in pushing the Soviet economy into collapse towards the end of the Cold War, and the Kremlin is not likely to want to repeat that mistake. The modernization of the military undertaken by President Vladimir Putin has certainly increased the effectiveness and prestige of his nation's armed forces. However, unless the government wishes to resort to nuclear weapons, as has so often been the case in Russian history, a choice must ultimately be made between military and society. Given that an overemphasis on might over legitimacy resulted in two separate regime collapses in the country during the last century, is in the current leadership's best interest to consider another tact. Nevertheless, while internationally recognized universities, a history of intellectual achievement, and low tuition rates may very well make Russia more competitive in the field of higher education, it seems unlikely that the country would be able to parlay excellence in this area into reliable influence abroad. There is, however, hope in this pit of despair. As in the days of Peter the Great, Russia can, for its model, look west, toward Great Britain in this case. While the United Kingdom does effectively use educational diplomacy to its advantage, the comparison the Kremlin ought to consider is not the high rankings of Oxford and its sister universities, but the so-called special relationship between England and the United States. Some 6.5 decades ago, London found itself in a position of a rapidly declining power. The homeland was badly damaged, and its far-flung maritime possessions were becoming too costly to maintain. Thus, facing a critical juncture, Winston Churchill went about securing a privileged place for his country alongside the newly minted superpower across the Atlantic. Even as England has clearly receded into the background in terms of capabilities, it has maintained its relevance. Might it not be worth evaluating the prospects of a similar relationship between Russia and China? In Russia's case, the need to forge close ties is not necessarily as imperative, but it can also not be left indefinitely. In order to successfully achieve this objective, Russia must prove its usefulness, indispensability to, but at the same time its independence from China. The former criterion is probably well met already, given Russia's natural resources, military technology, and its ideological similarity to the Chinese government, including, among other things, a resistance to unipolarity and support for a more centralized style of rule. Education, especially as laid out in Russia's current vision for reform, is an excellent vehicle for fulfilling the second qualification, demonstrating that Russia has problem-solving ideas to offer. Russia should, as England did, attempt to pass off some of its protective responsibilities on a rising power. Indeed, if any chance of signing a mutual defense treaty with China becomes possible, it should be taken, while recognizing that it's always risky to proffer concrete goods for promised future actions. Even if the trade-off was returning considerable portions of the territories gained by the treaties of Aigun and Beijing in the mid-19th century, as the unequal treaties, it would still be quite worth it to lay the foundation for true security cooperations between the two countries. Although parallels are by no means equivalent, Great Britain too had to sacrifice some of its land holdings for the sake of its position. In short, to borrow from game theory terminology, a country with limited options must make the best of its decision nodes. There's a line of argument that recent Russian military adventurism can be attributed as a response to shrinking capabilities, that is, acting decisively while still able. The same assertiveness would not be misplaced in diplomatic relations. Moscow must operate from a position of strength, while the Chinese leadership still respects their northern neighbors as generally equal partners. The goal is to become something akin to a right-hand man, not a vassal state. What has been proposed is, in fact, not extremely far removed from what Russia's leadership has been engaging in over the past decade or so. A declining power maintaining the appearance of a great power. To reiterate, the idea is not to become subservient to China. In fact, far from it. Moscow seeks international status, and China is projected to be the world's foremost power within a century. It would certainly seem that the potential exists for a special relationship that preserves Russia's prestige, best embodied by the following comment from Putin himself. Chairman Xi Jinping and I have developed very trusting, I would say friendly relations. Just as Churchill aligned his country with America's burgeoning star, Putin could do far worse than bandwagoning with Beijing. Russia has coexisted as knowing neighbors with the Middle Kingdom for almost 4 centuries without having to resort to a declaration of war. If there's any country in the world that Moscow might feel comfortable sacrificing some influence to, it should be their partner to the south. Moreover, and of critical importance, the arrangement need not be permanent. Allowing China to take the lead for now, while focusing on internal issues, should actually improve Russia's long-term outlook for maintaining a lofty position in the international hierarchy. But Russia must prove its suitability for such a special relationship instead of a mere strategic partnership. Enhancing the quality of its institutions of higher learning is a great first step towards this goal, emphasizing soft power instead of hard power to illustrate that Russia can be a partner that enhances, not threatens, China's own stability as it ascends toward primacy.